want to focus on two reasons why the Lord typically speaks to us in parables. One reason which you find very much in the gospel, and another one kind of made up, right? So basically one reason why the Lord speaks to us in parables is because of the nature of the subject matter. To frame the issue, this is from Bishop Robert Barron, think about this recurring situation of like boy meets girl. So there's a boy, he sees a girl from afar, he's interested possibly in dating her. So what does he do? So maybe he begins by looking her up on the internet. Typing in her name, looking up different things about her, kind of checking her social media, and that kind of thing. Maybe he goes and talks to her friends, finding out more information about this person through that particular vehicle. And maybe he simply looks at her from afar. But then eventually, as we all know, if the young boy wants to actually get to know this young girl, eventually he needs to pick up the courage to go talk to this young girl. And when he does so, what's going to happen? Will she say certain things about herself that he already knew by way of reason and observation? 100%. If the conversation continues, and she continues to self-disclose about her inner life, eventually she will say things about herself that he could not verify ahead of time through reason and observation, but which he can still accept as being true based on a relationship of trust. And the third way of knowing a particular person we might call revelation. So how do you know God? You know God through reason, through observation, but also revelation. Now, I love that particular analogy because it says something to us about the nature of revelation, the nature of that particular subject matter, right? So what's revelation? Not simply a series of abstract propositions about the spiritual life, but it's the result of God's free choice to self-disclose about his inner life and the path to a deeper relationship with him. And once you understand that, once you have this kind of nuanced and complex and multi-layered notion of what revelation actually is, it makes sense that the Lord typically doesn't talk about these things using abstract statements. The answer is X as opposed to Y, or the moral of the story is this as opposed to that. Whereas you look at parables, all the imagery and language of poetry lends itself to a deeper recurring invitation to go deeper and deeper and deeper over many years over the course of your life. That's why when you look at a parable like, the parable of the weeds and the weeds, or the parable of the prodigal son, it's hard to reduce it to like one thing because that's not the point, right? The nature of the subject matter, right? Revelation is God's inner life and the path to a deeper relationship with him. By its very nature, it's an infinite mystery. It can't be reduced to like one thing, and the parables reflect that particular reality. Now that said, look at the gospel, right? So the gospel gives a very explicit reason as to why the Lord uses parables, right? So the same question is posed by the disciples to the Lord. Why do you speak to the people in parables, right? Gospel of Matthew chapter 13, right? And what the Lord says basically is like, look, people see without seeing, they hear without hearing, they don't understand with their hearts, but I long for them to turn to me and thereby become healed. And it speaks to us about this recurring tendency on the part of the people of God, like all of us, to have a certain hardness of heart when it comes to God's grace, when it comes to his truth. And so again, this is borrowing from the language of Bishop Robert Barron, right? So what the Lord does, he leads with the beautiful. I think we talked about this before, but just to make sure we're on the same page, right? So Aristotle talks about the three great transcendentals, the good and the true and the beautiful. And the idea is that when it comes to communication, especially when it comes to evangelization, what do I lead with? And what he says is that if you lead with the true, telling people what to think, people tend to get their backs up. If you lead with the good, telling people what to do, well, that's not good too, right? If you lead with the beautiful, simply look at this beautiful thing, and people don't feel threatened by that. But here's the thing. These things are what you might call mutually implicative. So regardless of which one you start with, if you follow the thing to its natural conclusion, it will lead inevitably to the other two. So if you begin with the beautiful and the person pursues that, again, to its natural end, inevitably it will lead to the true, it will lead to the good, it will lead to the Lord, who alone is the way, the truth, and the life. But more to the point, because the Lord is talking about hardness of heart, it's no coincidence that this question, why do you speak to them in parables, coincides with this really famous parable, the parable of the sower, because this particular parable articulates three key reasons why people tend to be resistant when it comes to God's grace, when it comes to God's truth. So, just to recap, right? So there's a sower, he's sowing seed, and the seed is emblematic of the Word of God. And when it falls on the soil, there's a lot of fruit. 100-fold, sometimes 60, sometimes 30. But 3 out of 4 times it doesn't bear fruits. When it falls on the path, when it falls into rocky ground, when it falls into thorns, not so much. So what I want to do, I want to walk you through those different images because they're all, of course, really important. you got to keep in mind that the path used to be the rich soil. The path used to be the rich soil. It used to have this capacity for richness and growth. It had enormous potential. But then what happened? What happened to make the soil into the path? Basically, things were allowed to trample upon the soil. Animals, people, vehicles. Now it's hard. Now it has no capacity to receive the seed, right? The analogy that comes to mind, or the example that comes to mind, I often think about this with regards to children, right? So the communication isn't working. Why is that? Could be because of a cognitive thing. You're pitching it a little too high, right? So maybe you got to modify your pitch or modify your presentation. But something I had to remember, especially when it comes to older kids, is that a lot of times there are factors which go beyond the immediate communication or presentation, which are compromising the communication, right? So maybe screen time, right? Social media, binge watching, stuff on TV, pornography if they're older kids, right? All these things which are emblematic of the path. You got to keep that in mind, right? Think about the thorns, kind of a similar thing, right? So the way it's phrased in the gospel, the cares of the world and the allure of wealth. The cares of the world and the allure of wealth. The more accurate word is mammon, right? So the cares of the world and the allure of mammon. Mammon is not strictly riches or money or cash. It's anything less than God. So cares of the world and the allure of anything less than God chokes out the word. So I often think of this in terms of like vision, right? So your field of vision is wide, so I can see all of you at the same time, but at the same time, your focal point is narrow. If I'm focused here, by extension, I'm not focused there. And we do it a lot of times when it comes to like affairs of the heart, right? We tend to get fixated. The example that comes to mind is kind of silly, but it helps to illustrate the point. In my first parish, there was someone he wasn't angry about the thing I preached about, but like he just was confused, this young man. And so he came to me and said, Father, you mentioned this thing, and I don't know, could you explain that? I didn't quite get that. And it confused me, and I realized, oh my gosh, the real problem was that he stopped listening after the first 30 seconds, which broke my heart, but whatever. Anyways, but that's emblematic of the thorns, right? So like fixated. I'm looking at this, and then like this rest of my life is like dead to me. Now the rocky ground is kind of interesting. I think a lot of times we look at the symbol of the rocky ground, we think, okay, the barrier there is fear of suffering. But you got to pay attention to how it's worded. So basically the seed is sown on the rocky ground, and there's no depth, there's no root. As a result of which, when times are tough, the thing kind of dies, right? So again, when you look at that, people think, well, gosh, it means fear of suffering, but it doesn't actually. If you read between the lines, the particular obstacle there is superficiality. Superficiality. I have no roots. And so when times become tough, that's when I fall away. A superficial approach to not just Christianity, but life. So a lot of times, adults will say to themselves, and maybe even to other people, I have a complete understanding not just of Christianity, but of the world. So I have all the answers. I don't need to learn anymore because I have all the answers, right? And that could be for a whole variety of reasons. Maybe you've read a lot of books. Maybe you've been Catholic for a long time. Maybe you have a higher level of education. Maybe you're simply older, right? But you got to ask yourself, do you really have a complete understanding of all things? Maybe, if you're honest with yourself, you made a decision a long time ago to stop listening, to stop growing, to stop changing. And that's the image of the rocky ground. A superficial approach to life, as opposed to a desire to always go deeper. One final example, just to kind of bring it home, right? So one of my favorite podcasts these days, it's not even a Catholic podcast, it's a podcast about movies, and it's called The Rewatchables. And basically it's called The Rewatchables because they pick these movies that they need to be of certain quality and therefore rewatchable. So one particular episode, they were talking about that movie Big, starring Tom Hanks. I'm sure everyone's seen it. 1988. Simple plot. There's this kid, he's 12 years old, he makes a wish, becomes big. That's the plot, right? So he becomes this adult in his 30s. And the question was asked during the podcast, like, hey, what's everyone's favorite scene from that Tom Hanks movie, Big? And everyone pretty much gave the same answer. If you've seen the movie, this is probably your favorite scene too. It's a scene where Tom Hanks, his character, is in a toy store, along with his future boss, and they're playing the piano with their feet, right? So it's this toy piano, huge keys, black and white, that's on the floor, and you play the piano by dancing on the keys. Super cool, really famous scene. But what's interesting is that everyone who said that was my favorite scene, they confessed they had mixed feelings. So on the one hand, fantastic scene. Production value, creativity, the way it hits all those narrative beats, like fantastic. Classic, iconic scene. So 100%. Also, it touches on something in terms of my childhood, right? Like, oh, it's beautiful. It reminds me of when I was a kid, when I used to play with toys and be carefree and all these different things. But on the other hand, all these different people said, I also felt this deep sense of sadness when I watched that scene. A deep sense of lament. I lament the loss of my childhood. There was a time when I had the capacity for wonder, when I had the capacity to be carefree, and when I had the capacity to be lost in the moments. But then I got older. I got responsibilities, and now I'm just worried and afraid like all the time. I don't like that. And I watch this scene, and I feel something tugging on my heartstrings, but it makes me feel sad. And what's interesting is that the conversation stopped there, just when it was getting interesting. The thing about the parable of the sower, the Lord is saying to us, like, even though there is a bit of a learning curve to recover a sense of childhood sensibility and spiritual childhood, however you want to frame it, it is possible to regain all those things that perhaps you lost many years ago. That's why it's really important to be attentive to these different temptations, represented by the path and the thorns and the rocky ground. The Lord is steering us in the right path and showing us, again, it is possible to see with your eyes, to listen with your ears, to understand with your heart, so that you might recognize the Lord and turn to Him and thereby be healed. Peace and joy and happiness and freedom, all these things which are the fruits of coming back into right relationship with God.